People say that sometimes love will cost more than you can bargain, and in the Middle Ages, falling in love with a person in the same gender can also mean getting burned to death. Yes, you heard that correctly. This is why when talking about the Middle Ages, a lot of things come to mind. But I think we can all agree that homosexuality is not on the list. However, you would be surprised about how present this kind of love was during the Middle Ages. This, of course, came with a price. And while it's not the kind of connection and relationship that comes easily, a lot of people still find themselves in the company of another from the same gender, even if it means being burned to death. Today, let's go back in time and discover the brutal truth of being homosexual during the Middle Ages, homosexuality during the Middle Age. Surprisingly, same-sex relationships were prevalent, and it was normal for males to have both male and female lovers outside of marriage. This was in the past. Even the great Plato equated the acknowledgement of homosexuality to democracy and its repression to tyranny, with the latter being perceived as a means of population control. But it's important to take note that it was not until the 1800s that the labels heterosexuality and homosexuality were coined. During the Middle Ages, these concepts were not understood or acknowledged in the same way as it is today. For instance, no one would have identified as homosexual, straight, lesbian, transgender, or bisexual, nor would they have called anybody else such during the Middle Ages. At that time, the Christian Church determined what was considered acceptable and unacceptable sexual activity. It was also revealed that the majority of historical materials about same-sex partnerships between women during medieval times are few. Sodomy, on the other hand, was the term for any sexual activity that did not lead to pregnancy. And though it was still hard to give title to these forms of sexuality, in actuality, the Church was against all forms of sexual expression that are not normal. The 6th century Byzantine Emperor Justinian enacted numerous prohibitions as a result of his strong distaste for homosexuality. He stated that certain men were seized by the most disgraceful lusts and acts contrary to nature. He held gays responsible for earthquakes and floods. Not unlike the Christian right of today, who assert that lesbians and gay men are to blame for natural disasters, which they claim are God's vengeance. He also advocated for severe and brutal penalties, like as genital mutilation, that were specifically aimed at men. But it seems like the emperor's prejudice came from a much deeper reason, one of which might be the events that occurred during his reign. You see, throughout the 6th century, the inhabitants of Constantinople endured immense suffering. 40% of the population perished from the bubonic plague, and additional deaths were caused by multiple earthquakes that shook the region. For Justinian to be successful in his military conquests, his army needed young, physically fit men. This was only possible with a sharp increase in the population, which same-sex relationships are not capable of. Sodomy during the Middle Ages. After the Codex Justinianus, ecclesiastical condemnation of homosexuality began to reappear in the 11th century, and few of the legal doctrines of Emperor Justinian have resurfaced at the University of Bologna in Italy. This led to a resurgence of his views on homosexuality and the associated penalties, which affected views and actions throughout Europe. At that point, the clergy started to receive unrelenting criticism. Peter Damian penned the Book of Gomorrah for Pope Leo IX in the middle of the century. In addition to becoming a cardinal and doctor of the Church, Damian was a significant contributor to the development of Gregorian reform, a movement that Pope Gregory VII spearheaded, focusing on the self-reliance and moral rectitude of the clergy. In the documents, Damian enumerated 4 types of behavior that met the criteria for being considered sodomy: anal sex, which he claimed was the most obvious, mutual masturbation, solo masturbation, and intercourse between the thighs of 2 people of the same sex. Oddly enough, oral sex is not on the list, although Damian thought sodomy to be even more wicked than bestiality. Damian thinks that the angry lay people are starting to become violent due to the clergy's bad behavior. He stated that homosexuals should not be appointed, and those who already were ought to be excommunicated regardless of their age or situation. But Poglio disliked the concept of eliminating clergy until they had committed crimes repeatedly over an extended period, even though he thought that all vice should be condemned and favored celibacy for the clergy. Going to London, the Anselm of Canterbury called a council in 1102. It was the catalyst for the Gregorian Reformation and forbade all members of religious orders from engaging in adultery or intoxication before marriage. The council further declared that any priest found guilty of sodomy would be demoted. The endeavor to enforce celibacy among clergy members most likely played a role in fostering aversion against homosexuals, and therefore the psychological tensions brought on by complete chastity led to people's irrational hatred of homosexuality. Money was always a factor, of course. As the church grew wealthier, a married priest's allegiance would naturally be divided between the church and his family. A clergyman was more likely to leave his surviving spouse and children any money and property he held after his death than to leave it to the church. At the same time, in the Holy Land, Warmond, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and King Baldwin II organized the Council of Nablus, which produced a canon law that included penalties for sodomy. They initially surfaced in medieval law. According to Canon 8, adult sodomites who are both active and passive shall be burnt at the stake. According to Canon 9, only the active party should be burnt, and the passive party should confess their sins if the passive party is a minor or an adult. If a sodomite repents, he can avoid punishment according to Canon 11, but if he is found to have committed sodomy a second time, he will be permitted to repent once more but will subsequently be banished. But what worsened the situation of Christian homosexuals was the claims that God himself hated such acts. Hildegard of Bingen, a Christian mystic and polymorph who was born 7 years after St. Peter Damian's death, claimed to have seen visions and recorded them in a sexually illustrated book. In the second book, she explained how God forbade women from having sex with one another, quoting, "A woman who takes up devilish ways and plays a male role in coupling with another woman is most vile in my sight, and so is she who subjects herself to such a one in this evil deed." Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican monk and theologian, supported natural law later in the 13th century, thinking that having intercourse creates new life, and that this cannot happen in a same-sex relationship. He saw homosexuality as a sin, second only to bestiality, and an unnatural vice. And the Catholic Church was greatly influenced by Thomas Aquinas' views. Their primary worry was the possibility of societal deviance, in this instance homosexuality, that is, men having sex with other men. They were prosecuted after being accused of having immoral behaviors, the punishment. Of course, while talking about these great sins, there is no way people in the Middle Ages did not receive harsh persecution for identifying as different from others. The 11th century saw the rise in popularity of the Cathar faith. It dominated the southern French language region's religious landscape by the 13th century. The Cathars lived frugal lives, were vegetarians, supported gender equality, and had no issues with homosexuality, euthanasia, or contraception. Of course, the Catholic Church regarded these doctrines as unacceptable. This prompted those who were persecuting them to charge them with sodomy. A crusade against them was authorized by Pope Innocent III in 1208. Thousands of Cathars from all across Europe were slaughtered over decades of persecution, regardless of their rank, age, or sex, by sword or mass burnings. Paris was populated primarily by sodomites, according to the French theologian and canon Jacques de Verty in 1230. He stated the following quote, "Prostitutes dragged passing clerics the brothels by force through the streets." Furthermore, some teachers and students were expelled from the University of Paris in 1292 as a result of a gay scandal. In Venice and Rome, there was male prostitution, lesbianism, and transgender individuals. Also, according to Palmer, the friar and historian Salambian de Adamo, homosexuality was particularly prevalent in the 13th century among intellectuals, clerks, and nuns. Alfonso X of Castile and Leon in Spain issued the first European decision in the 13th century, mandating castration and stoning as penalties for any offense against nature, including sodomy. Given that limbs were frequently amputated for crimes like adultery and blasphemy, one could argue that the severity of these punishments for homosexuals was not out of proportion to those meted out for what were considered other offenses against God at the time. In 1206, France declared it illegal for two persons of the same sex to have sexual relations. For a first infraction, the punishment was excision of the testicles or clitoris, and for a second offense, amputation of the breasts or penis. A third misconduct called for a stake burning. Louis IX declared anal intercourse a death offense with burning as a punishment 10 years later. The first execution in Western Europe took place in 1292 in what is now Belgium, when 2 men were executed for same-sex acts. Florence even established special courts to try and punish sodomy offenses in 1432, making it the first city in Europe to do so. Only one can imagine the harsh and brutal punishments homosexuals suffered during the Middle Ages. The Knights officers prosecuted approximately 10,000 men and boys over the following 70 years, finding at least 2,000 of them guilty. And we don't know how many more undocumented killings and persecutions are left buried down in history. We are just grateful that massive political movements today have overturned the majority of these draconian laws in many parts of the globe. However, it's crucial to reflect on the past and research these heinous acts of earlier times. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more stories from history.